It didn't always feel like loneliness. That's the part that makes it difficult to explain. You weren't necessarily alone in rooms. There were people nearby, voices, movement, a sense of activity. But there was another kind of absence, a quieter one, the kind you feel when something inside you reaches outward and finds nothing coming back. You learned early how to keep yourself company, not as a skill to be proud of, but as a necessity. You noticed that certain feelings didn't have a place to land, that questions could sit unanswered for long stretches of time, that being understood wasn't something you could depend on, so you stopped waiting for it. You don't remember deciding this. You remember adjusting. You became observant, careful, internally busy. While other children moved outward, you moved inward. You learned how to think things through on your own, how to calm yourself without reassurance, how to sit with confusion without asking for help. People often describe you as independent. They don't realize how early that independence began. There's a particular sensation that comes from growing up emotionally alone. It isn't dramatic. It's subtle. A constant feeling of being slightly out of sync with the world around you, present but not fully accompanied. You learn to read between words, to sense moods without them being named, to understand situations without explanation. That awareness became second nature. Even now, you notice shifts before others do, a change in tone, a pause that lasts too long. The moment someone pulls back before they admit it, you don't react outwardly, you store it. You've always been good at storing things, feelings that didn't have witnesses, thoughts that didn't feel welcome, questions that seemed inconvenient. You learned to keep them inside until they made sense. Sometimes they never did. You grew up faster in certain ways, not because you had to care for others, but because you had to care for yourself emotionally. You didn't expect comfort to arrive, so you became comfortable without it. That comfort, though, came with a cost. You became self-contained. You don't easily assume others will understand you. You don't naturally expect to be supported. When something feels heavy, you don't instinctively reach outward. Reaching feels uncertain. So you think instead. You analyze, you reflect. You replay conversations long after they end, not because you enjoy it, but because your inner world learned to do the work that wasn't being done elsewhere. You're often told you're thoughtful, deep, insightful. People admire your perspective. They don't see how that depth formed. They don't see how often you had to process emotion alone. How early you learned to become your own witness. You became skilled at understanding others because understanding was how you stayed connected without being fully seen. You learned how to listen without interrupting, how to empathize without being asked, how to be present without demanding presence in return. People feel safe with you. They open up, they confide, they relax, you hold space naturally. But when it's your turn, something shifts. You don't know how to step into the center without discomfort. You don't know how to be emotionally uncontained in front of someone else. You don't trust that your inner world will be handled gently. So you keep it tidy, you share selectively, you edit yourself, you stay composed, not because you're closed, but because you learn that exposure doesn't always lead to connection. You've noticed how often you feel closer to people in your head than you do in real time. You understand them deeply, but they only see parts of you. That imbalance feels familiar. It echoes childhood, being present without being fully met. You don't resent it. You normalize it. You tell yourself you're just private, just introspective, just someone who doesn't need much. But sometimes, late at night, a different feeling surfaces, a quiet ache, not for attention, but for resonance, for the sense that your inner experience exists inside someone else's awareness. You've learned to live without that. But living without something doesn't mean you don't feel its absence. It only means you adapted. Those adaptations didn't disappear when you grew up. They became the way you think, the way you approach relationships, the way you make decisions, the way you process pain. You don't expect others to fill emotional gaps. You fill them yourself. That self-sufficiency looks like strength, and it is, but it's also a clue. People who never felt emotionally alone don't think this way. They don't monitor connection. They don't brace for misunderstanding. They don't assume silence means disinterest. You do, automatically. Not because you're pessimistic, but because you learned what happens when you hope too openly. So you hope quietly. You stay observant. You stay measured. You stay slightly detached. And that detachment isn't indifference. It's familiarity. It's the echo of having learned very early how to be with yourself when no one else showed up. That realization hasn't fully landed yet. For now, it lingers in the way you think before you speak, in the way you hesitate before you trust, in the way you've built an inner world that doesn't require an audience. And beneath all of that, a question waits. What kind of thinking develops in a child who learns how to be emotionally alone before they ever learn how to be emotionally held? As you grow older, that early emotional self-reliance doesn't disappear. It organizes itself. You begin to notice that your mind moves differently from others, slower in expression, faster in recognition. You don't rush toward closeness. You don't assume availability. You don't expect emotional presence to be consistent. Instead, you prepare for gaps. When connection feels warm, part of you stays alert. When someone listens closely, you wonder how long it will last. When care appears, you accept it quietly, almost carefully. But you don't lean into it fully. This isn't fear, it's calibration. You learned early how to adjust your expectations before disappointment could arrive. This is where something subtle shifts. What others interpret as emotional distance isn't distance at all. What looks like withdrawal isn't a lack of desire. What feels cold from the outside is caution refined over time. You don't avoid connection. You approach it with measured depth. Your thinking reflects this. You don't assume people will meet you where you are. You check first. You observe. You wait. You've become skilled at reading what's available without asking directly. You trust consistency more than words, effort more than promises, patterns more than reassurance. That way of thinking didn't come from pessimism, it came from experience. From learning that emotional presence can vanish without warning. From realizing that needing too much, too openly, can leave you exposed. From understanding that closeness doesn't always mean safety. So you became internally anchored. You learned how to sit with feelings without external validation, how to think things through alone, how to carry complexity without sharing it immediately. That inner containment can look like detachment to people who rely on constant emotional exchange. But detachment isn't what you feel. You feel depth just privately. This is the psychological truth that often goes unspoken. People who felt emotionally alone as children tend to develop a relational mindset rooted in self-witnessing rather than co-regulation. They become their own mirror. They don't wait to be understood before understanding themselves. They don't require immediate reflection to remain stable. When emotional presence fades, they don't collapse, they adjust. That adjustment creates resilience, and it complicates connection. You don't naturally assume someone will hold your inner world with care. You don't relax into interdependence easily. You don't hand over your emotional center without hesitation. Not because you don't want closeness, but because closeness once arrived inconsistently. So your mind learned to stay one step ahead. You think in contingencies, in emotional backups, in internal support systems. You always know how you'll handle things if no one shows up. That preparedness feels like maturity, but it carries a quiet grief. The grief of never fully trusting that someone else will stay present when things get heavy. The grief of being skilled at solitude when you didn't choose it. The grief of realizing how much you've carried alone. You don't dramatize this grief. You rarely name it. You simply notice certain patterns. Intimacy feels easier in thought than in practice. Being understood feels safer internally than externally. When things get overwhelming, you retreat into reflection rather than reaching outward. You've built a rich inner life. It keeps you steady. It keeps you thoughtful. It keeps you functioning. But it also keeps you slightly separate. You're rarely surprised by disappointment, rarely caught off guard by withdrawal, rarely shattered by loss. Not because you don't care, but because your system was trained not to rely too heavily on anyone else's presence. That training worked, and it shaped how you think about closeness. You don't assume it, you don't chase it, you don't depend on it, you allow it carefully. And when it fades, you don't panic, you return to yourself. That return is familiar, comfortable even. It's the place you learned to stand when nothing else felt reliable. But sometimes, in quieter moments, a different awareness surfaces. Not urgency, curiosity. You begin to wonder what it would feel like to not anticipate emotional absence, to not prepare for being unseen, to not keep one foot anchored in self-containment at all times. The question doesn't demand change. It doesn't ask for action. It simply asks for honesty, because the way you think didn't form randomly. It formed around a truth you learned early, that emotional presence was not guaranteed. And now, as an adult, that truth still shapes how you move toward others and how much of yourself you allow them to see. You don't need to resolve this tonight. This isn't about fixing anything. It's about recognizing the architecture of your inner world, how it was built to survive emotional solitude, how it still protects you, how it quietly influences every connection you make. Sit with that, not to undo it, not to judge it, just to notice how much of your thinking was shaped by learning how to be emotionally alone long before you ever had words for it. Some understandings don't close a chapter, they simply change how you read everything that comes after.